Hello, my name is Samantha Knox. I am a senior in the social work program here at MacMurray College. I am currently completing practicum hours at a local agency which serves individuals with disabilities who wish to live independently. The following is a brief description of an ethical issue I encountered out in the field during my semester. The consumer involved is an adult male with cognitive disabilities. The consumer lives with his sister, who also serves as his payee. His sister also has cognitive disabilities, but to a much lesser degree than the consumer. The consumer requests assistance in assigning his sister as his medical power of attorney. And when given the case, I was told that the consumer had been the one that placed the request. But after subsequent investigation, I found that it was actually his sister who had placed the request. As more details of the situation came to light, it was reported to me that the consumer had expressed a desire to undergo a gender reassignment surgery, and that this was a decision that his sister was not in favor for, and possible motive for her wanting to obtain power of attorney. What concerned me about this situation was the level of the consumer's capacity to comprehend what he was actually requesting and the implications of such an action, and the potential harm that could be inflicted upon the consumer. And actually, what was the consumer's actual wishes? Was this something that he wanted, or was he just going by what his sister was saying? Our textbook states that when one is in need of ethical guidance, they should first use the ethical rule screen. When using the ERS, the social worker consults the National Association of Social Workers, or the NSAW Code of Ethics, to find values, principles, or standards that apply to the situation. If a value, principle, or standard is found to apply, then the social worker follows what the code says. If not, then the social worker is to move on to the ethical principles screen. For this issue I presented today, with the staff member, I referred to the ethical rule screens, which provided more questions than answers or guidance. Really, and that was just due to the amount of gray in the situation and the questionable capacity of the consumer to comprehend actually what was going on. The consumer is an adult and is his own guardian, but he is also highly suggestive and lives with his sister, who is wanting him to get the power of attorney. So there was a real question of how much influence she had over him. And due to like I said earlier, due to the amount of gray, I just moved on to the ethical principle screen. When using this screen, the social worker refers to a list of principles that have been ranked in order of importance. The social worker identifies which principle involves ranks most important and then acts in accordance with that principle. In addressing this issue, I referred to the ranked list to determine which principle ranked most important. Initially, I thought the principles involved were protection of life, self-determination, and social justice. After consulting my field director, protection of life was eliminated from the list of potential principles since the potential for harm was not imminent or lethal. The consumer's life wasn't in danger if his sister obtained a power of attorney, only his autonomy was. Which leads to the next principle, social justice. When I was thinking of this principle, I was really faced with the question of, would this request be an issue if not for the nature of the consumer's disability? And I really could not answer that question, because every time I came back to it, it was his ability to understand that I was concerned with. So was I really working for social justice if I was trying, judging whether or not he could actually do it? So that left me with the remaining principle of self-determination. The consumer's right to decide for himself. So working with this principle in mind, all that is left to determine is whether the request is really that of the consumers or his sisters. The values involved in this issue were the dignity and worth of a person, the importance of human relationships, and integrity. The principles involved in this situation were that the social worker should respect the inherent worth of the person, respect the relationships are important, and see the consumer or client as a partner in the helping process. And with that, to be mindful of the relationships, both familial and social, that are involved. With these things in mind, I took actions that preserved the consumer's self-determination without damaging his relationships. The consumer and his sister, between his consumer and his sister, sorry. The next principle states that the social worker will practice in an honest manner, congruent with the NSAW Code of Ethics. To do this, I must allow the code to guide my actions, utilize the ERS and EPS, and provide informed consent, ensuring that I present the information in a way the consumer can understand. I don't have the standards up on the screen, there was just not enough space for them, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of information of the standards that do apply in this situation. The first ethical standard is 1.01's commitment to the client. Under this standard, the social worker is to promote well-being and put their interests before that of the social worker. The next standard is 1.03, informed consent, which was a really big one in this situation. It states that the social worker uses clear and understandable language to inform the client of the details of service, and also allows for the client or consumer to ask questions. Next standard is standard 1.06, conflicts of interest, which states that the social worker avoids any conflicts of interest by clarifying with all parties where the social worker's loyalties lie and who is actually designated as the client in that situation. The final standard is 1.07, privacy and confidentiality. The social worker will not disclose clients' private information without permission. This came into play a lot because the sister was involved. And although both of them had received services from the agency, it was only one that was receiving this service. So we were really watching what information I was giving to her. While working through this ethical issue, the big task of facilitating a power of attorney was broken into smaller, ethically sound decisions and tasks. The first of which was to inform the consumer's sister that the consumer really needed to be the one to request the information. Since it concerned him, he needed to do the call. In doing this, I respected the consumer's dignity and worth of a person and the commitment to the consumer. The next decision was to locate and provide a basic power of attorney form. The initial form that I received was very complicated and very convoluted, very difficult to follow, even for myself. So my thought was, if I have difficulty understanding this, then the consumer's probably gonna have difficulty following me as I struggle through it. So I did some research and found a more streamlined form, more basic language, and just didn't have as many moving parts. And I also located that on the state website. So it was official. While meeting with, the next step was to meet with the consumer and walk through the form with him and explain things that he needed to explain and to ask him open-ended questions so that I could get a better gauge on his comprehension level of it. And one of the things I did was I asked him for examples of when the power of attorney would go into effect, just so that I knew that he understood that this wasn't an all-powerful thing where his sister could just say what he wanted, even if he could speak for himself. And he was able to give examples of that. Then I gave him half the form that did not have the signature page, that had sections of it highlighted that we had discussed so that he could go and talk to his sister about it. The next decision was to meet with the consumer and his sister upon consumer's request. We did not seek the consumer out. I waited for consumer to call back. And during that meeting, the consumer did state that he wanted to obtain power of attorney and assign it to his sister. And I asked again questions to evaluate both the consumer's and his sister's level of comprehension. and provided any missing information. With that, I provided the signature sheets to them and told them where they could go to get it completed and left it up to them to do it, left it up to him to do it. While meeting with the consumer and his sister, information about obtaining guardianship was withheld from his sister since she was not the consumer and the consumer himself did not request any of that information. But it was decided that if she were to come to the agency on her own behalf as a consumer and ask questions about guardianship, that we would give her the information at that time. Supervision and consultation really took place throughout the whole process in this. The case was initially reported to me and another staff member who had their master's in social work. So right from the beginning, we were looking at the ERS, seeing what fit, saw all the gray in it, so we moved on to the EPS. I engaged in consultation. I consulted another staff member who was known to both the consumer and his sister, and who was also the legislative advocate and had knowledge about the whole power of attorney and guardianship process. And she was able to kind of point out some loopholes and some things like that that we didn't think about. And again, I consulted with the field director and briefly with the director of the BSW program at MacMurray, at which time the principle of protecting the consumer's life was taken out because it was seen as it's not really imminent and he wasn't at risk. Let's see. While working through this issue, I found that getting a new set of eyes on the issues helped and provided different ideas that I hadn't thought of before, just from having been so immersed in that situation. It gets difficult to kind of see all the other moving parts around. Areas of its success, really a lot of it came from making an effort to work in the best interest of the consumer, of what the consumer wanted, not what I wanted. Making an effort to explain the power of attorney. The informed consent was really important because I was just really concerned about making sure that he knew what he was doing or what he was asking. I took care to act in his best interest, did not provide any opinion in the matter, and followed what the consumer wanted. I made sure to use really neutral language and didn't offer suggestions. If he asked, I just kind of turned it back to him because I didn't want to influence him in any way. Areas I struggled with, I've mentioned throughout this, is really a big one was struggling with my own need to protect the consumer. I believe this comes from a bias where I view individuals with cognitive disabilities as a population in need of protection rather than in need of support, kind of working with them. And I found myself developing an inner dialogue stating something along the lines of, "You're doing it again, knock it off." Anytime negative or catastrophizing thoughts crept into my ethical decision-making process. I had to be mindful of the language I used while speaking with the consumer to avoid any influence in his decision-making. The textbook used for this course states that when a person or a client is in a population of less power, they are more likely to just go along with whatever the social worker suggests. When this occurs, the client loses their freedom of self-determination, and taking advantage of that would have been unethical, and I did not want to do that. So I made sure to use neutral language, and again, asked for my opinion. I turned it back around to him. Another thing I struggled with was educating the sibling about the consumer's rights and that she was not the consumer in this situation. That seemed to be really difficult for her. I think, again, she's just used to protecting her brother and wanting to do what she thought was best for him rather than what he wanted. And like I've mentioned before, the consumer sister has a cognitive disability, which is to a less severe of a degree than the consumer. But again, I use very clear and common language used during the process. And lastly, the power of attorney form, I've already mentioned before. I had to find a more simple form to use, and that took some effort. The ambiguity faced in this, ambiguity is imperfect or incomplete information about an issue. The textbook identifies 3 types of this, with the goals and values, scientific knowledge and facts relevant to the situation, and consequences of the intervention. Working with this consumer, the ambiguity of the goals exists when looking at the amount of influence the sister has over the decision-making process. And ambiguity with the facts of the situation exists in regard to the consumer's cognitive capabilities. And there was no formal documentation of any evaluations that he had, any diagnosis or intelligence test. I was provided with none of that. I was going in, not knowing any of that. So again, this is why so much time was focused on breaking down the process and the implications of the power of attorney into consumers' own language. Ambiguity of the consequences of the intervention really came into play at the end. After I've given the form, really don't know what happened. Don't know if he followed through with it. Don't know if she just took the form and attempted to follow through on her own, or if they just didn't say anything about it. I've seen both of them since, and neither of them have said anything about the form, so I don't ask. If they want to go there, then I'll go there. Lifelong learning. I am aware of the importance of lifelong learning. To best serve the client and consumer, a practitioner must be current in the advances made in the field. Changes to policy, practice, and knowledge occur regularly, and as a lifelong learner, I intend to stay in compliance with my continuing education credits, for my CADC and anything else that comes along. I am planning to obtain subscriptions to professional journals in the field of social work and substance use treatment. And I intend to obtain my LSW when I'm able to, about 3 to 4 years. And I am contemplating entering a graduate program to obtain my master's before my advanced standing expires in about 5 years. I'm also going to continue to do my yearly CPR and Narcan trainings, which are a requirement of my employment. And I would like to continue learning more about trauma due to the high rate of trauma reported by people with substance use disorders. Here are my references. Any questions?
I have one.
Yes.
When it comes to thinking about the ERS versus the EPS, you were talking about in this particular situation, you had noticed some gray areas or ambiguities in the ERS that drove you to the EPS that really highlighted self-autonomy for the particular client and supporting that in the best way that you could. Tell me a little bit about how legally was your client able to kind of make decisions for himself, and then how does, as long as you're giving that client informed consent, were you protected by the code with the ERS?
He did not have a court-appointed guardian. He's his own guardian. How that occurred, I do not know. So legally, he is able to make his own decisions. He does have a payee, but she didn't have any other controls over his decision legally. I did my due diligence. I found a form that was easier to understand. I went sentence by sentence with him and explained it to him as best I could. I elicited examples from him and his own understanding of the form, and I only gave him the rest of the form when I felt comfortable that he knew what he was asking, like what the implications were. And I believe that that would cover under that, because in the code it states that if the person is unable to read or has limited capabilities, that we are to do what we can to make sure that they know exactly what it is, and that is what I did.
Right. Did it make you feel uncomfortable professionally and personally, hard to tease out the two, to do that, to give him as much information as you possibly could, not really knowing what the comprehension level was?
That was the thing that really stuck out to me, was not knowing, because I had asked multiple staff if they knew exactly what his levels were, and I was given age ranges that he would be similar to, but that really didn't give me a good idea. It's hard to tell if it was professional or personal, because I do have that drive to protect individuals with learning disabilities and cognitive disabilities. So I did my best to drown that out. when he came in versus it just being his sister, it helped me to feel a little bit more comfortable professionally with it. I think that if it was someone other than the sister who is the payee, who also lives with, he lives with, I think that would make me feel even more comfortable. But in the end, he is his own guardian, and I have to respect his autonomy and his right to make his own decisions.
Perfect, thank you.
Any more questions?